Thank you very much. Yeah, so what I'm going to be talking about today, obviously, is excavations that we carried out as part of the Islands of Stone project. So this is a 3-year AHRC-funded project, and it's set out to investigate Neolithic crannogs in the Outer Hebrides. It's led by Fraser Sturt of the University of Southampton, along with Duncan Garrow at Reading and Angela Gannon at Hess, who's also here today. And I am the postdoctoral researcher on this. So what I want to start with today, for those of you who don't know what a crannog is the Canmore definition. So essentially they are a very broad class of site. They're artificial islands, either partly or wholly artificial, and they're created by alternating layers of materials until you get a mound or an islet that arises from the loch or estuary. They also are, obviously they exist in different states of preservation and modification. So just from these examples here, you can see how diverse they are. And they also encompass a broad period of time. So basically from prehistory to the medieval period. There are 446 crannogs listed in the NRHE in Scotland, and 43 of those are in the Outer Hebrides. And this is interesting because based on the research that we did in the first year of this project, along with research by other PhDs and other projects, there is actually an estimated 170 to 200 modified islands in the Outer Hebrides. So this is a bit of semantics, but really what this demonstrates is there's a great potential for more of these sites to be classified as crannogs, and not only that, as Neolithic crannogs. So this is really the crux of the issue because there's only around 50 that have been excavated, and the majority of those excavations were during antiquarian research. So late 19th, early 20th century. Now, a few more have been dated, so we have about 1/4 of the record has been dated, but this includes both typological and absolute dating. So the dates commonly occur within the Iron Age, but the caveat to this is that I would say crannogs are sort of like icebergs in that what you see on the surface is only a small part of what's going on underneath. So really to understand these sites, we need to get down to the earliest levels. And a lot of the materials that have been recovered from these sites, especially during antiquarian excavations, were not from the earliest levels. So again, there's a lot of potential to explore these further. The reason this is important is because what's happened in the past decade. In 2012, a local of Lewis by the name of Chris Murray began diving on some of these islets, and he discovered lots of really amazing Neolithic pottery. So what this showed us is essentially artificial islands were being constructed nearly 4,000 years earlier than this, date that we think of the Iron Age, and also that they're a wider spread phenomenon. So at the time, we only had one known example, and that was Ellen Donnell in North Uist, and that was considered to be, this exceptional site. But now we're beginning to rewrite the map and redraw the map and populate it with Neolithic crannogs. So after some investigations in 2016 and 2017, Duncan and Fraser then formed the Islands of Stone project. So it's quite a broad project. One of the main aims is to determine whether crannogs extend beyond Lewis and North Uist. So we're employing a variety of methods for that. I won't go into it, but basically we're doing some data mining, a bit of machine learning, and this summer we're going to be out investigating around 20 sites that we have identified as potentially being Neolithic. The second part of the project is to really focus in on one site and begin to understand how and why these structures were being built. So from the work that we did in 2016, 2017, we were out at Loch Borgasdale, and we noticed that there were horizontal timbers running out of the base of the structure. So we knew it was a good site to not only learn about how it was being constructed, but also to get a lot of organics for dating and to really build that understanding of the relationship to the broader environment. We were out last summer and we employed a variety of methods, but I'm just going to focus on the excavations because some of the other post-ex analyses are still ongoing. So here we are. You've seen this already this morning. We're in the Isle of Lewis. The site we're working on is very near to Carloway. If any of you are familiar with Dune Carloway, the really extraordinary Iron Age brook. And we're about 7 kilometers, north of Callanish, which you have seen this morning from Richard. Here's the site itself. You can see it's quite a rugged landscape. It's a sort of knock and lock-in landscape to the south, and all of it is filled with peat, again, as you heard this morning. So it's actually a challenging site to work on. You can see the amount of equipment that we needed to bring on site and the location of the nearest road, which is nearly 1 kilometer to the north. So all of this equipment has to be brought out to site through this really boggy moorland. It's also a really difficult site to work on because, of course, it's an island. So for the terrestrial crew, any spoil that they created had to be removed and had to be taken off of the islet. So in total, they filled 29 one-ton bags of spoil. So this was a lot of trips back and forth. And sometimes it's sort of a comedic affair, but it looks something like this. And you can imagine that happening over and over and over again. For the team that was working underwater, we also had a few logistical challenges. Of course, when we're diving on site, we need to have two divers, plus a dive supervisor, plus all of our scuba equipment, tools that we might need, petrol for the water pump, etc. So all of this, of course, then has to be taken out and back numerous times throughout the day. So bearing those logistics in mind, I'm going to focus on the excavation now. So this is our pre-excavation survey of Loch Borgestale. And what we initially wanted to do was run a single trench from the causeway side to the sort of northwest down across to the opposite side. So as you've kind of seen, this just involved removing a bit of vegetation and lots of peat. They got down to this flat base, and that was pretty much it. There was very little information gathered about the site at this point. So we then decided to extend it on the causeway side. Once again, very little information. So we extended again on the east side. Now it was at this point that we noted a sort of kern-like feature to the east. Let's see if barely see my mouse there. So the sort of circular feature here on the eastern side or the right-hand side of the Crannog. And so they started to dismantle that. And within that makeup, they found a really lovely saddle quern. Other than that, very few materials were recovered. So it's basically 3 pieces of worked flint. So at this point, again, they have some time left and they're thinking we need more information about this site. So they decided to actually dig down into the base of the Crannog and remove stones. So they created this sort of 1 by 1.5 meter sondage down into the structure. And that's when things started to get really interesting. So here's a section of the sondage. Essentially, they removed the stones and they came down on this clay base. It seemed to form a sort of base for the stones. There was then underneath that a series of layers associated with burning. So you can see that reddish layer has bits of charcoal and peat ash in there. Below that, there was another clay layer, and then they came on this really nice layer of organics. So it was primarily heather, brushwood, and small round wood. There was another layer of clay, and then there was another more substantial layer of organics underneath. So I'll just show you that here. This is the upper organic layer. You can see the twigs and the composition of that, and you can see just how thick it was. And it was from this layer and below that they started to recover Neolithic pottery. So lots of pottery, and all of it was Neolithic. For the underwater excavation, what we wanted to do is extend that initial trench out into the water. So you can see the grid that we put in place here. We started with a 2 by 3 meter grid, And we later extended 2 meters into the crannog and another meter away from it. And so we're excavating on snorkel or later on scuba, and we're using an induction dredge. So much easier than the terrestrial crew who's having to move back and forth in their boat. We're just lifting sediments with the dredge, much like a vacuum, and they're being lifted away. And all of that's being powered through these hoses that are connected to a floating pontoon. So what we saw underwater then, if you look at the image of the excavators, they are actually moving backwards, that 1 meter extension, backwards. And so that's the sort of present day lock bed deposits. That was about 1 centimeter to 3 centimeters thick. Below that, there was this really bright yellow silty clay layer, which you can see on the bottom left image in that little section there. Below that then was this dark organic silty layer, and it didn't occur all over the site. So we weren't really sure if it was even a context, but when we extended into the crannog, we found a much thicker deposit. So if you look at the image on the top right, just kind of here, it's this brownish organic material. So that is very, very similar to what they were seeing in the sondage. So it's just a brushwood layer, bits of hazelnut shells and lots of little bits of wood. Below that, or in other places below the yellow clay layer, we then came down onto lots and lots of timber. And this is really incredibly preserved. It still has bark attached on a lot of the pieces. And it's sort of embedded in this gray silty sand. So just to show you those from aerial perspective, this is our pre-excavation survey. We're coming down onto that yellowy, orangey clay. You see the timbers starting to emerge from that. And once we were happy with that context, we cleared all the way down to the timbers. And then we had our final extension. So this is a 6 meter long trench. The timbers continued beyond that. So we don't actually know how much further they go beyond this. From that sort of organic layer and below, especially within this timber layer, we found lots of different materials. So we have cow's teeth, hazelnut shells, lots of worked quartz, and lots of pottery. So the pottery in total, it has been analyzed, and it's estimated to be between 60 and 90 vessels, individual vessels, that we recovered between the terrestrial and the underwater excavation. So what we did as a recording method, because it is a difficult site to work on, is everything was recorded digitally. So we have this born digital method, and I've shown you the images already of the orthomosaics that you can see on the left there of the different phases of excavation. And we were using those to create our plans. And we also have some nice digital elevation models, which give us an indication of the height of these structures. So all of this was recorded using a drone. We have this amazing Matrice 300 with a built-in RTK. You can see it flying over the Crannog doing the survey on the right there. And we were also able to produce some really nice 3D models, which you'll see in a bit. The underwater survey, it's a bit less complicated. We had 2 GoPros. We had them on a stereoscopic rig so they could take simultaneous images. And it was just a matter of a person on snorkel swimming over the site and recording it. And again, you can see, you saw the outputs already from the orthomosaics, but we also have some nice elevation models and 3D models as well. And of course, we had to record everything a bit more precisely. So we use ground control points. We put them on the shore, on the loch shore, on the crannog, underwater. Plus we have all the points that we took when we were recording the context and features. So really this is important because this is how we begin to stitch our models together. Because as I said, crannogs are like icebergs. So we can't have 2 separate excavations going on and 2 separate data sets if we really want to understand these structures. We were really, really fortunate that we collected so much data. This, for instance, is processing of one of the Crannog models, and you can see the underwater grid within that. So we were able to put our points in and kind of slowly stitch everything together. And once you clean it up, now we're beginning to see that relationship between the timbers and the stone. And you can see that the timbers are continuing underneath the stones. here's a bit of more of a close-up of that. So you can really see that relationship there, and you get a sense of how far these timbers are extending out from the stone structure. And like I said, these are what are being used to then create our plans and sections. So it's a matter of taking all of those models, stacking them up, and then slowly drawing out the various contexts and features within that. With the digital elevation models, we were then able to get height values so we could run profiles across the island. We created pseudo sections when we were creating the photogrammetry models. And by combining all of this, along with a few hand-drawn sections, we're able to get a profile across the site. Still a bit of work in progress, but essentially what we're looking at is on this side here, on the eastern side, we haven't actually reached the bottom yet. So we will be back in 2023 to continue excavating. And one of the things we want to see is now what's going on underneath this. So we have a sense of the profile here. We're currently thinking that the entire site is anthropogenic. So what we're really interested in is, yeah, what's going on underneath these layers of timber here. One of the final things that we did is a very large survey all the way around the Crannog. So it was about 10 meters out from the stones. The reason we did this is because firstly, we knew from the underwater excavation that the timbers are continuing. So we're trying to get a sense of just how much further it goes, especially before we go back in 2 years and begin to excavate again. But we also have this really steep drop off on the east side of the Crannog. And we also have seen numerous timbers, horizontal timbers, sticking out of the side of the, yeah, so you can kind of see them there. And there's one there. So we can see them kind of sticking out of the sediments here. And they look like a sort of revetment around the structure. So really we're thinking that actually maybe this is a lot bigger than just a little stone islet. So here's our full combined model. We have our, our final excavation, you can see with the sondage there. We have our final underwater trench, and then we have a sort of pseudo bathy around the entire site. And you can see sort of how big this site is if we start to then digitize some of the timbers. So obviously we took this with RTK points, but also because we have that orthomosaic, that imagery, we can actually really digitize the timber, see the orientation and the layout. So if we overlay this with some of the aerial imagery we have, really what we're looking at now is not this small 11 to 12 meter structure. Actually, we're thinking it's something more like this 23 meter in diameter structure here. And you can really pick this out with the sediments because you can see that sort of orangey, yellowy coloring. So this is really interesting and not quite what we were expecting. Just to end with our final sort of preliminary results, we were very, very surprised when we got some of the dates back. So returning to the sondage, essentially this bottom organic layer here, all of the larger timbers, everything that was excavated underwater is entirely early Neolithic in date. So 3,500, 3,300 BC, around about. What was very surprising, however, is the clay underlying the stones, and this entire these burnt layers here produced Middle Bronze Age dates. So there's a bit of a confusion in the middle here because we had a Bronze Age date that was underneath a Neolithic date. So this top upper organic layer still needs to be refined a little bit. But what this means essentially is that we're looking at a 23 meter Neolithic structure that was abandoned for nearly 2,000 years before a Bronze Age community comes back, maybe has some burning activities, and then pile a massive amount of stones on top. So just to summarize with some of our key findings at the moment. yes, we have this wooden architecture that is extending well beyond the stone islet. So the crannog is not just the stone islet. It's this much larger structure that's going on under the water. Also, all of the material culture that was recovered during excavations come from that timber phase, and all of it is Neolithic. And finally, it appears that we have a wooden phase that is not in relation to the later stone phase. So we actually have two very distinct sort of periods of activity taking place on site. So it's kind of left us scratching our heads a little bit if we should be rethinking the name of the project, but be it as it may. Finally, if you're interested in the whole of the project itself, please check out our website, which is crannogs.sutton.ac.uk. When we finalize the interim report, once we get the final post-ex analyses back, that will go up on the website. We also have a few sketchfab models. So some of what I've shown here, plus some more models of the underwater trench and some of the materials. That's on our sketchfab page, which is IOS_Hebrides. And finally, as a bit of a community engagement, we have created a 360-degree tour of the excavation from last summer. It's a really tedious URL, but that QR code will take you there as well, or you can ask me afterwards and I'll be happy to pass that on. But it's really cool because it walks you through, you have these 360-degree views from various points in the landscape, and there's lots of images, videos, photos, 3D models, all sorts of material that you can interact with. Finally, I just have to say that none of this would have been possible without the amazing team that we had on site. It's a very challenging site to work on, as I've shown, and not always the best weather, but we always had a pretty cheery, chipper group on site with us. Some of those are not shown here, such as Angela. And yes, there's far more people, and there's far more people involved in the post-ex analyses as well. So just have to give a final acknowledgement to all of them. Thank you.